The Pilgrim's Progress in Modern English, Part 2. Dear courteous companions, some time ago, I shared with you the dream I had about Christian the Pilgrim and his dangerous journey toward the celestial country. It was a joy for me to tell, and I trust it was both pleasant and beneficial to you. At that time, I also told you what I saw about his wife and children, how unwilling they were to go with him on his pilgrimage, so much so that he was forced to leave them behind and continue on alone. He dared not risk the danger of the destruction he feared would come if he stayed with them in the city of destruction. Therefore, as I showed you then, he left them and departed. Now it has happened that because of many responsibilities and interruptions, I've been held back from my usual travels to the places from where he started, and so I haven't had the chance until now to inquire further about those he left behind. I wanted to give you an account of them, but having had some business in that direction recently, I journeyed back that way. And lodging one evening in the woods about a mile from the city, I fell asleep and dreamed again. In my dream, I saw an aged gentleman passing by where I lay. Since he was traveling a portion of the same road I was, I rose and went with him. As we walked along, as travelers often do, we fell into conversation. Our talk turned to Christian and his travels, and so I began with the old man. "Sir," I said, "what is the name of that town below us, lying to the left of our path?" He answered, "That is the city of destruction, a busy place, but it is filled with lazy, ill-natured people." "I thought so," I said. "I once passed through that city myself and can confirm what you've said is true." The old man, whose name was Mr. Sagacity, sighed and replied, "Too true. I wish I could say better things about the people who live there." "Well, sir," I said, "I see you are a well-meaning man, someone who enjoys hearing and sharing good things. Let me ask, have you ever heard of a man from that city named Christian who set out on pilgrimage to the higher regions?" "Have I heard of him?" Sagacity exclaimed. "Yes, and I've heard of the troubles, battles, sorrows, and fears he faced on his journey. The entire country knows his story now. Hardly a home exists that hasn't heard of him and sought out the records of his pilgrimage. Though many mocked him while he was here, now that he's gone, people speak of him with great admiration. It's said he now lives gloriously where he is. Even those who would never dare face the dangers he endured envy the rewards he has gained." "They would do well to think so," I replied, "if they believe anything true. Christian now lives at the very fountain of life. His rewards come without labor or sorrow. No grief is mixed with them. But tell me, what do people say about him now?" "Ah," Sagacity said, "people say the most remarkable things about him. Some say he now walks dressed in white robes. Others claim he wears a golden chain around his neck and a crown of gold adorned with pearls on his head. It's said that the shining ones who appeared to him during his journey are now his constant companions, and they treat him like a dear friend. Beyond that, it's confidently reported that the king of that glorious place has already given Christian a rich, beautiful home near his court. Every day, Christian eats, drinks, walks, and talks with the king himself, receiving his smile and favor. Some even believe that the king will soon visit this region and ask why Christian's neighbors treated him with such contempt when he first set out on his pilgrimage. They say the king considers any offense against Christian as if it were done to himself, because Christian acted out of love for his sovereign. Indeed, I said, my heart swelling with joy. I'm glad to hear this, for the sake of that poor man. Now he rests from his labors. He reaps the rewards of his tears with joy. He's beyond the reach of his enemies, safe from those who hated him. After a pause, I added, I'm also glad that word of these things has spread across this country. Who knows? Perhaps it may inspire good in those still left behind. But tell me, sir, do you know anything about his wife and children? Poor souls, I can't help but wonder how they're faring." Sagacity smiled. "Ah, you mean Christiana and her sons. They're doing well, very well indeed, though they all acted foolishly at first and stubbornly resisted Christians' pleas. Second thoughts have worked wonders in them. They've packed their things and have gone after him." "Really?" I exclaimed. "His wife and children? All of them?" "Yes," Sagacity confirmed. "I know the story well. I was there when it happened. I saw it all with my own eyes." "Then," I said, "it must be true." "You may confidently say so," Sagacity replied. "Christiana and her 4 boys have all set out on pilgrimage. And since we seem to be traveling a fair distance together, let me share with you the full account of how it happened. This Christiana, for that was her name from the day she and her children decided to live as pilgrims, began to feel her thoughts stirring deeply after her husband had crossed the river and she could hear of him no more. First, she grieved over the loss of her husband and the breaking of their loving bond. For you know, nature cannot help but weigh the living down with heavy thoughts when remembering the loss of dear loved ones. Her grief for her husband cost her many tears. But that wasn't all. Christiana also began to reflect on whether her own unkind behavior toward her husband might have been part of the reason she no longer saw him and why he had been taken from her in such a way. At this, memories flooded her mind, swarming her thoughts. All the unkind, unnatural, and ungodly ways she had treated her dear husband. These memories pricked her conscience and burdened her heart with guilt. She was deeply broken as she remembered her husband's groans, his bitter tears, and the ways he mourned over her. She recalled how she had hardened her heart against his pleas, his loving attempts to persuade her and their sons to join him on the pilgrimage. Oh, there wasn't a single thing Christian had said to her or done in front of her while he bore his heavy burden on his back that didn't now flash back at her like lightning. Each memory tore at her heart, but nothing struck her more deeply than his desperate cry, "What must I do to be saved?" That cry echoed in her ears with a sorrowful, haunting ring. Then she turned to her children and said, "Sons, we are all undone. I have sinned away your father, and now he is gone. He wanted us to go with him, but I refused. I stopped you from going with him too. I have kept you from life." At these words, the boys burst into tears, crying out that they wanted to follow after their father. "Oh," Christiana wept, "if only it had been our lot to go with him, then we would be far better off than we are now." She continued, "I once foolishly thought your father's troubles came from a wild imagination, or because he was overwhelmed by melancholy thoughts. But now, I cannot shake the thought that his troubles came from something far greater. The light of life was given to him, and with that light, he escaped the snares of death." At this, they all wept again, crying out, "Oh, woe to us this day!" That very night, Christiana had a dream, and behold, she saw a large scroll opened before her. On it were written all her deeds, and her crimes appeared as dark as ink. In her sleep, she cried out, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner!" Her little children, hearing her cry, were startled awake. Then she dreamed again. This time, she saw 2 dreadful, sinister figures standing by her bedside. They whispered to one another, "What shall we do with this woman? She cries out for mercy both waking and sleeping. If we let her go on like this, we'll lose her, just as we lost her husband. We must, by one way or another, distract her from these thoughts of what lies ahead. Otherwise, nothing in this world can stop her from becoming a pilgrim. Christiana woke suddenly, trembling and drenched in sweat. For a long time, she lay awake in fear, but at last, she drifted back into sleep. In this final dream, she saw her husband, Christian. He was in a place of unending joy, surrounded by immortals. He held a harp in his hand, playing it before one seated on a throne with a rainbow encircling his head. She watched as Christian bowed low, his face touching the shining floor beneath the feet of his king, and said, "I thank you, my Lord and King, with all my heart for bringing me to this place." At this, a great company of heavenly beings surrounding him lifted their harps and played. They shouted with joy, but the words of their song could only be understood by Christian and those who stood with him. The next morning, after she got up, prayed to God, and spoke with her children for a while, there was a loud knock at the door. She called out, "If you come in God's name, enter." The one at the door replied, "Amen," and opened it. As he stepped in, he greeted her, "Peace be to this house." After saying this, he asked her, "Christiana, do you know why I have come?" At this she blushed and trembled, her heart filling with a growing desire to know who he was and why he had come. He then spoke to her. "My name is Secret. I dwell with those who live on high. Where I come from, it has been said that you desire to go there. It is also known that you are aware of the wrongs you have done to your husband, how you hardened your heart against his path and kept your children in ignorance. Christiana, the merciful one has sent me to tell you that he is a God who delights in forgiving and takes joy in offering abundant pardon for offenses. He also wants you to know that he invites you into his presence, to his table, where he will feed you with the best of his house and with the heritage of Jacob your father. There your husband Christian is, along with legions of companions, always beholding the face that brings life to all who look upon it. They will rejoice the moment they hear the sound of your feet stepping across your father's threshold." At these words, Christiana was overwhelmed with shame and bowed her head to the ground. The visitor continued, "Christiana, I also have a letter for you sent by your husband's king." She took the letter and opened it, and immediately a fragrance like the finest perfume filled the air. The letter was written in letters of gold, and its message was this: the king wanted her to follow the same path her husband had taken, for that was the way to reach his city and dwell in his presence with eternal joy. At this, Christiana was overcome with emotion. She cried out to the visitor, "Sir, will you take me and my children with you so that we too may go and worship the king?" The visitor replied, "Christiana, the bitter must come before the sweet. Like your husband before you, you must go through troubles before entering the celestial city. So I urge you to do as Christian did. Go to the wicket gate over there across the plain. It stands at the head of the way that leads upward. I wish you all the best on your journey. Also, I advise you to keep this letter close to your heart. Read it often, both for yourself and to your children, until its words are imprinted in your mind. For this letter is one of the songs you will need to sing during your pilgrimage. And remember, you must present this letter at the far gate." Then in my dream, I saw that the old gentleman telling me this story was deeply moved as he spoke. He continued saying, "Christiana gathered her sons together and began to speak to them. My sons, as you can see, I've recently been deeply troubled in my soul over the death of your father, not because I doubt his happiness, for I am now certain he is well, but I have also been heavily burdened by thoughts of my own state and yours. I truly believe that, by nature, we are in a miserable condition. The way I treated your father during his suffering weighs heavily on my conscience. I hardened my heart and yours against him, and I refused to go with him on his pilgrimage. The thought of these things would utterly destroy me, were it not for the dream I had last night and the encouragement this stranger gave me this morning. So come now, my children. Let us pack up and go to the gate that leads to the celestial country. There, we will see your father and be with him and his companions in peace, living according to the laws of that blessed land." At this, her children burst into tears of joy, overwhelmed that their mother's heart was so inclined. The visitor bid them farewell, and they began to prepare for their journey. While they were busy getting ready to leave, two women, Christiana's neighbors, came to her house and knocked at the door. Christiana called out, just as she had before, "If you come in God's name, enter." The women were stunned. They had never heard such words come from Christiana before. Still, they entered. But when they stepped inside, they found her preparing to leave her home. They asked her, "Neighbor, what are you doing? What does this mean?" Christiana turned to the older of the two, whose name was Mrs. Timorous, and replied, "I am preparing for a journey." Now this Timorous was the daughter of the man who had met Christian at the Hill of Difficulty and tried to persuade him to turn back because of the lions. "A journey?" Timorous exclaimed. "What journey are you talking about?" Christiana answered, "To follow after my dear husband." At this, she began to weep. "I hope not," Timorous cried. "Oh, good neighbor, for the sake of your poor children, do not throw your life away so recklessly." But Christina stood firm. "No, my children will go with me. Not one of them wishes to stay behind." Timorous stared at her aghast. "I truly cannot understand what or who has caused you to think this way." Christiana sighed deeply. "Oh, neighbor, if only you knew what I now know. If you did, I am sure you would join me." What new knowledge have you gained that has turned your mind so completely, drawing you away from your friends and tempting you to go to who knows where? Timorous asked, exasperated. Christiana replied, "I have been deeply troubled since my husband left, but especially since he crossed the river. What weighs on me the most is the way I treated him when he was in distress, and now I find myself in the same condition he was in then. Nothing will satisfy me but to go on pilgrimage. Last night I had a dream. I saw him. Oh, how I long for my soul to be where his is. He lives in the presence of the king of that glorious country. He sits at his table, eats with him, and is a companion to immortals. He has been given a house there, one that makes even the finest palaces on earth seem like mere dung heaps in comparison. And the prince of that place has sent for me too, with the promise of welcome and hospitality if I will come. His messenger was here just now. He brought me a letter, a personal invitation." With that, Christiana pulled out the letter, unfolded it, and read it aloud. She then looked at them and said, "Now, what will you say to this?" Timorous threw up her hands in frustration. "Oh, the madness that has overtaken you and your husband to throw yourselves into such hardship. You've heard, haven't you, of the dangers your husband faced? Even from the very first steps he took? Our neighbor Obstinate can still testify, as he went with him for a short time, and Pliable too, at least until they both turned back like sensible men, unwilling to go any further. Think also of what your husband endured, the lions, Apollyon, the shadow of death, and all the other trials. And what about the dangers of Vanity Fair? If he, a man, could hardly bear such things, what can you, a poor woman, hope to do? Consider your 4 sweet children. They are your flesh and blood. Even if you are foolish enough to throw your own life away, think of them. For their sake, stay at home." But Christiana said to her, "Do not tempt me, my neighbor. I now have an opportunity placed in my hands to gain something of great value, and I would be the greatest fool not to take hold of it. As for the troubles you warn me I might meet along the way, they are far from discouraging me. In fact, they show me I am on the right path. The bitter must come before the sweet, and that will only make the sweet even sweeter. So, since you did not come to my house in God's name as I asked, I pray you to leave me now and not disturb me further." At this, Timorous scoffed and said to her companion, "Come, neighbor Mercy, let us leave her to her own choices, since she so clearly despises our advice and company." But Mercy hesitated and couldn't so easily agree with Timorous. She had two reasons for this. First, her heart was moved with compassion for Christiana. She thought to herself, "If my neighbor insists on leaving, I will at least go with her for a little while to help her." Second, her heart was stirred for her own soul as Christiana's words had begun to take hold of her. She thought again, "I will stay and talk more with Christiana. If I find truth and life in what she says, then I will go with her wholeheartedly." So Mercy began to reply to Timorous, "Neighbor, I did come with you to visit Christiana this morning, and since she is, as you see, taking her final leave of the country, I think I will walk with her for a little while this sunny morning to help her on her way." But she kept her second reason to herself. Timorous scoffed again. "Well, I see you are just as foolish as she is. But mark my words, while we are safe and out of danger, we are out. But once you are in, you are in." So Mrs. Timorous returned home, and Christiana began her journey. When Timorous arrived at her house, she called for some of her neighbors, Mrs. Bat's Eyes, Mrs. Inconsiderate, Mrs. Lightmind, and Mrs. Know-Nothing. When they had all gathered, she began to tell them the story of Christiana and her plans to leave. She began her tale. "Neighbors, having little to do this morning, I went to visit Christiana. When I arrived, I knocked on her door as we all do, and she answered, 'If you come in God's name, enter.' Thinking all was well, I went in. But to my surprise, I found her preparing to leave the town, she and her children. I asked her what she meant by this, and she told me plainly that she was determined to go on pilgrimage, and just like her husband. She also told me of a dream she had, and that the king of the country, where her husband now is, had sent her an invitation to come." Mrs. Know-Nothing asked, "Do you think she will actually go?" "Yes, she will go," Timorous replied. "She's determined, no matter what happens. And I know this, because the very argument I used to persuade her to stay, the trouble she's likely to face on the way, is the same argument she uses to justify going. She told me outright, 'The bitter must come before the sweet,' and that makes the sweet even sweeter." Mrs. Bat's Eyes shook her head. "Oh, what a blind and foolish woman. Can't she take warning from her husband's suffering? If he were here again, I'm sure he would have been content to stay safe and sound and not run into so much trouble for nothing." Mrs. Inconsiderate added, "Good riddance, I say. Let such fanciful fools leave town. If she stayed here with that mindset, who could live peacefully beside her? She would be either gloomy, unneighborly, or constantly talking about things no sensible person could tolerate. I, for one, am not sorry to see her go. Let her leave, and may someone better take her place. The world hasn't been right since these whimsical fools began living in it." Mrs. Lightmind chimed in. "Come now. Enough of this talk. Yesterday, I was at Madame Wonton's, and we had the best time. So merry, like proper ladies. Who do you think was there? Mrs. Love the Flesh, Mrs. Lechery, and a few others. We had music, dancing, and everything else to make the day delightful. I must say, Madame Wanton is such a refined woman, and Mr. Lechery is quite the charming fellow.